Good afternoon. It's September 28, 2021, and welcome to The Frontier. My name is David Leeson, and I'm your host today of today's edition of Thinker's Corner. Today, we're talking about housing affordability. This is indeed a crisis in many of the markets in Canada and an important issue. In fact, when we look at opinion polls, this recent federal election, we found this was one of the top issues for Canadians is housing affordability, as well as affordability for life in general. So what are the root causes of this unaffordable housing crisis? What are the practical solutions? And how do we grab a hold of this critical issue? So today, we're going to get into more of an in-depth discussion about this issue with world-renowned housing affordability expert and Frontier's Senior Fellow, Wendell Cox. Welcome, Wendell.
Thank you.
I want to introduce Wendell to everyone. I've enjoyed getting to know Wendell over the years, and he's an incredible leader and thinker, and particularly on this issue. And just a little bit of background, but Wendell is the principal of Demographia, an international public policy firm located in St. Louis, Missouri. And he's a founding senior fellow at the Urban Reform Institute based in Houston. He's a senior fellow with the Frontier Center for Public Policy based in Winnipeg, and a member of the advisory board of the Center for Demographics and Policy at Chapman University in Orange County, California. He has been serving as a visiting professor at the Conservative National des Arts et Métiers in Paris, France. And his principal interests are economics, poverty alleviation, demographics, urban policy, and transportation. And he's the co-author of the well-known annual Demographia International Housing Affordability Survey, sponsored in part by Frontier, and author of Demographia World Urban Areas. So a warm welcome to you, Wendell, and we're so honored to have you here for this discussion.
A pleasure.
So, Wendell, the last time I checked, the Canadian Mortgage Housing Corporation said that affordability for housing was defined as some 30% of your average income. How do you define affordability?
Well, we actually use something called the median multiple. It's similar to that measure, but essentially we go back and we say, what did housing affordability look like back before all of the very stringent housing market regulations came into force in some, but not all metropolitan
We're a little bit frozen there.
Or markets?
That technical issue.
We define.
Can you just repeat that for a sec, Wendell?
We define housing affordability based upon a ratio of the house price, the median house price, the median household income. Historically, if you look at what we might call the Anglophile plus Quebec countries, if you go back to the early 1970s, virtually all or almost, virtually all of the major markets, and markets are metropolitan areas. They're not Vancouver or New Westminster, Markham. They are Toronto, GTA, and Vancouver Metro, et cetera. They were all at 3 times or less. Now we find Vancouver and Winnipeg, I'm not Winnipeg, Toronto at about 10, even before the pandemic. So we do it based upon a ratio of house price to house income, or to household income.
So in this recent election, federally, there was a lot of talk about housing affordability or lack thereof. Housing was described as a crisis in many markets in Canada. Is that accurate? Would you describe housing as a crisis?
Well, my sense is, and this is not in any way to criticize your national leadership, because the national leadership of virtually every country I know does not realize the seriousness of the housing affordability crisis that has overtaken our democracies. It is very threatening. And let me just, if I can just throw up one quick slide to give you an idea about how bad things are in Canada. And I need to get you this slide, and I got a little bit behind here. let's get that. Okay, now, if you look at this slide, remember we talked about the median multiple. That is the median household, the median house price divided by the median household income. Notice in 1971, the Statistics Canada census found that virtually all of the markets, the major markets in Canada, were at 4 or less, and they were below that even before there. And you see what happened. In 2004, 2005, that was the first of our housing affordability surveys. We've now been doing that 7 years. Notice that from 1971 to 2004, 2005, and the reason we have the 2 years there is we didn't cover Edmonton in 2004. We didn't have the data, but we added them in 2005. You notice that Vancouver had only moved up to about 5 from about 3.9. Toronto had actually improved its housing affordability over those 34 years. Yet look what's happened since. Toronto now is to 9.9 and Vancouver is to 13. And the other markets, Calgary and Edmonton, you can see going up there. And effectively what has happened, especially in the largest market, as well as Montreal, is there has been the imposition of urban containment policy, which increases the price of land on the fringe of the urban area. And what a lot of people don't realize, including a lot of economists, is when you increase the price of land on the fringe, you telescope that increase to the entire market. And what we see, and you know, we do the International Housing Affordability Survey. We looked at 92 markets last year, 36 of them, and this is an increase, 36 of them were rated severely unaffordable. That means a median multiple of more than 5. And every one of the severely unaffordable markets had urban containment policy. So,
okay, so let's just back up for a sec, Wendell. What do you mean by urban containment policies? What are you talking about?
The urban containment policy essentially tries to either ban or significantly reduce the availability of land on the urban fringe for developments. So, for example, in Vancouver, in Toronto, you have the Greenbelt policy, which basically says you can't develop any land for housing in the Greenbelt that was imposed in 2005, 2006. And notice what happened to housing prices in Vancouver or in Toronto. In Vancouver, you have the agricultural reserve. These are places where you cannot build.
So are you saying that government is causing this spiral that's rocketed
there's no
up?
Question about it. No question about it. And there have been other things too. You know, there are impact fees. There are more difficult requirements. But the big difference is, as we look at housing affordability around the world, is urban containment policy. And let me just show you one more slide here, because here, you see, I mean, this is a cost of living issue. Our research in the States indicates that among the high cost metropolitan areas, 85% of the difference between the high cost metropolitan areas and the average is in housing. I suspect the same is true in Canada, though we've not looked at it. Now, let's look at what has happened, however, just in Toronto. In Toronto, this is how much house prices have gone up in 1 year.
In 1 year?
In 1 year in Greater Toronto. Now, this is August to August. Just a few days ago, the data came out. So that, for example, for detached houses, up $270,000. That's with the median household income of 88. Semi-detached up almost twice as much. And so the basic point is, not only do you have a terrible housing crisis, housing affordability crisis, but it's getting worse and likely to get even worse, because your basic problem is there's too much regulation on the fringe. You force the prices up, and until you begin to release that pressure, house prices are likely to go up relative to incomes.
Okay, so if we could just pause here for a sec, because you hear a lot of noise about all the contributing factors among commentators in the media about what's driving this housing crisis. You hear about foreign investment, e.g. the Chinese. You hear about regulation. You hear about all kinds of solutions. We heard those from the parties in the last federal election. Some have even suggested the government starts building hundreds of thousands of housing units. But in the final analysis, you're saying something quite different. You're saying that the real issue is not the house price per se, although that could be a factor. It's really what's driving the increase in the cost of land. Is that right?
Oh, precisely. For example, you think about this. In Winnipeg, the median the ratio in Winnipeg, the median multiple is about 3.5 more in Winnipeg.
Okay, so that's affordable, right? In your
It's
definition?
close. It's close. It's a whole lot more affordable than 13. Do you know that the price of building a detached house in the Winnipeg CMA is just a little bit less than Vancouver? You know what the difference is? Every penny, almost every penny, has to do with land. And yes, regulation is important. This is the biggest regulatory problem is the urban containment policy.
Okay, so without trying to make this simplistic, then who are the villains behind this? Where did this originate from? Like it's almost bizarre that we don't hear this too often. We're starting to hear this thesis more often, Wendell, as time goes on. And you have the unique perspective that you do this massive international analysis. So you've seen it, you've seen this train wreck happen in slow motion. So who are the villains behind this? What's going on?
First of all, we need to recognize that the villains aren't villains at all. And by that, I mean, the villains were rightly inclined. They thought they were going to make the city better. They didn't pay enough attention to housing affordability. They didn't understand that if you don't have housing that's affordable, you don't have a lifestyle that is affluent. And it goes back a long way. Let's go back to the Town and Country Planning Act of 1947 in the United Kingdom. That's where all of this comes from. The idea of drawing boundaries around the city, saying, nope, no development out on the outside. And so now what you have, for example, is London, where the median multiple, not as bad as Toronto, but about 9.
Wait, London isn't as bad as Toronto.
No, London's not as bad. By the way, we do 92 major metropolitan areas, over 1 million in 8 countries. Vancouver rates second only to Hong Kong.
Wow.
Okay? So the basic point is, this has been standard urban planning operating procedure for years. It has taken years and years to get into North America. It came into Vancouver in the 1970s, a little bit in the 60s. In Toronto, unbelievable, they held on to the mid-2000s. I mean, the price increases that have occurred in the greater Toronto area are just plain incredible in just 15 years.
Wow. So this is incredible. It is a long history. And let me guess, it comes out of this kind of a classic philosophy that the answer to these challenges is central planning.
Exactly. And an absolute failure to look at the economics. The economics are so clear that it's unbelievable. And for the most part, economics has not figured in any of these decisions. And by the way, which in Canada are being made at regional levels, such as the GVRD. I'm not sure if that's the current name, but the Greater Vancouver Regional District. In Ontario, it's the province of Ontario. In other places, it's municipalities. But a lot of people in Canada think that the only thing that matters is city governments. Not a chance. In the Vancouver area, in the Toronto area, city governments do what they are told by the regional district in Vancouver and by the province of Ontario.
Okay, so in the constitutional framework of responsibilities in Canada, you're saying the provinces really bear the heavy lifting, the feds a little bit, but definitely at the provincial and municipal/regional level.
Yeah, well, and beyond that, I would say I wouldn't even give the feds as much credit in terms of how important they are, because they really can't do much of anything. The critical thing, if I understand the Canadian Constitution, is essentially the provincial level. I mean, right. The B situation where you have the regional organization controlling it, that's because Victoria set that system up in the 1970s. So the provincial level is crucial. There are things the feds can do. They certainly ought to be using what I would call the bully pulpit. They ought to be talking about this. They ought to be making the connection between poverty and housing affordability and all of that. they really can't do an awful lot.
Okay, so just to put things into context then, Ian, or sorry, Wendell,
Yeah.
we have a number of questions coming in here, by the way, from the audience, which is terrific. But Wendell, when we look at the larger strategic context, why do we care about this issue? To ask a really silly question.
Has to do with the cost of living. We are in the process in the Western world of destroying the middle class. Right now, every metropolitan area in Australia has adopted this. In Canada, you have three that are big problems: Vancouver, Toronto, and to a lesser extent, though getting very bad, Montreal, and Ottawa-Gatineau is also about that bad. But for example, you can go to Halifax, you can go to Winnipeg, you can go to St. John, you can go to Regina, you can go to Saskatoon, a little bit more expensive than they could be, but a whole lot less expensive than the rest of the country. The problem, and we have the same problem in the United States, is that the urban planners who love this kind of thing because it makes the city beautiful as far as they're concerned, they really aren't paying any attention to what it's doing to people. So that essentially what's happening is in the places that adopt these kinds of policies, people are not able to live nearly as good a life as they can live in the places that are still. And that's real important, not only because of housing affordability for the middle class, it's also important for low-income people because they are thrown out of the market and forced into subsidized, usually waiting lists, because house prices have become so expensive, and because in Vancouver, for example, or Toronto, they're paying 3 times to 4 times as much they should be paying for their housing. That's money that's not going into job creation and innovation, et cetera, et cetera. And there is research, and I apologize for dominating it here. There is good research in the United States that says we have paid one big price for housing in terms of our GDP because of housing regulation. And by the way, we've only got about 7 or 8, I think it's 12 of our major metropolitan areas out of 53 have urban containment policy. That shows you how toxic it is.
Wow. So this has a big impact on poverty.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. And you think about it. I mean, this is one of the things I've begun to get real concerned about, because a lot of planners and economists don't understand the connection. The fact is that when you allow market prices of housing to go up, you force up the price. You remember the CMAC 30% thing. Well, I hate to tell you, the latest data I've seen says that the average household in Canada is already paying 30%.
Wow.
It's happened all over the place.
Well, the last time I checked in the Vancouver area, the guideline is at 79% to buy the average household income to buy an average house in Vancouver. So that's pre-tax income. So that's impossible to get into the housing market, period.
Well, yeah, in fact, the RBC does a great job every month, or I think it's every quarter, of putting out an analysis where they look at average incomes and median house prices. And I mean, there have been times in the last couple of years, and things go up and down because, interest rates go up and down. There have been times to a detached house in the Vancouver market, you needed to have a monthly payment. You had a monthly payment more than 100% of your income. Yeah. So, I mean, and by the way, the sad thing, no one should think this is going to get better until we deal with land on the fringe, which is forcing the shore. We are only going to see things get worse.
So the other side that we hear in the popular media, certainly out of academic circles, is the so-called food security movement, and the idea that Canada's in deep trouble, that we've got a food supply issue, and that we've got to protect every square foot of land in our country. The last time I checked, we don't have a land supply issue in Canada. So how does this jive with that? Like, what's going on here?
This has been the old saw that planners have used for decades. Solly Angel, a good friend of mine, who is one of the best urban thinkers of the world, who's worked for the World Bank and is at New York University, he's done research and basically says, first of all, this is just plain non-issue. There is no shortage of land for agriculture. But let's talk for a moment about Canada. First of all, many estimates of the extent of urbanization around the world have been way high. And recently in the 2016 census, and this is not because the demographers have been remiss in any way. It's because we have gotten so much better ways of analyzing things in the last couple of decades. Stats Canada changed the definition of its urban areas, which it now calls population centers. And an urban area is what you would see at night from an airplane. And that is to say, the lights. And you, for example, if you fly over Vancouver, you're going to see a lot of land where there isn't any light. Well, the basic point is that they, as a result of this, they took out a lot of vacant land that was being shown as urban in the 2016 census. Today, if we think about the maximum amount of land that has been used for agriculture in Canada at the provincial level since 1951, okay, you take that and you say, let's call that the agricultural resource of Canada. You know how much that is urbanization? Urbanization that goes back to Jacques Cartier? 2.1%. In other words, 97.1%, 97.9%, almost 98% of the agricultural land at peak based upon a provincial analysis is still available for agriculture. One more point. If you look at the amount of land that has been taken out of production in Canada in that period of time, it is as large as the Maritimes. It is as large as New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and Nova Scotia. So
Wow.
It is not a problem.
So this is,
and you know what? A lot of this has to do, you know, oftentimes we hear planners talk about sprawl is the ultimate evil. Okay.
yes,
Well, let me tell you what's worse than sprawl: poverty.
poverty. You're right.
Yeah.
And so how do you define sprawl in your book? Like,
Well,
are you advocating that there should just be willy-nilly development all over the place?
No, I'm not advocating anything. I'm saying, for the most part, we should let the market decide. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't have zoning and we can't do that kind of thing. But the fact is that you know, in a country with as much land as Canada's got, we don't have to pretend that the next house we allow to be built outside the urban growth boundary in Vancouver is going to force somebody else to fall into the ocean. It's not going to happen.
So you're really, and I'm not trying to put words into your mouth, Wendell, you're really calling for a more balanced approach when it comes to these land restrictions, keeping in mind the need to supply sufficient land for development for people. Is that it?
Precisely. And the basic point is this is not being done. The planning establishment has basically defined sprawl to be the ultimate ill that must be defeated. And we don't care what we do to you people. Okay. And you know, 13 times incomes in Vancouver when it was only 3.9 back in 1971, somebody should have noticed.
Yeah. So that incredible graph you just showed a few minutes ago illustrates this huge inflection point and begs the question, the status quo isn't working. In fact, it's getting worse. We're putting people into poverty, and the next generation doesn't have a hope in Hades of getting a house.
Is that
it? In a number of these markets.
That's right. And beyond that, you have an interest on the part of the planners of forcing people into apartments. There's nothing wrong with apartments. I think the high-rise development in Vancouver is marvelous. And for anyone who wants to live in an apartment, fine. But, you know, the 40th floor balcony is not where you want to raise the child, probably.
Right.
And there are legitimate preferences with respect to housing. And essentially, the planners are trying to force people into apartments. That's not necessary. So anyway.
Okay, so I know a ton of urban planners. There's a lot of fine people. So I don't want to denigrate them in any way. But what's your take on that? Do you think that they're self-aware of this issue, or it's just simply not in their skill set or kind of training or knowledge?
Well, I guess I really can't make any comment really on their motivation or what drives them. All I know is you know, it strikes me that among the domestic priorities of any country, leaving aside defense for the moment, is the affluence of the population and the minimization of poverty. It strikes me that's what we ought to be doing. Clearly, the system is not producing that. Now, by the way, that doesn't mean it's not producing that in some places. It's not because the people in Regina, for example, or the people in St. John or Moncton are better than the people in Vancouver or Toronto. It's because they've left things somewhat alone.
Okay, so let's just
And
pick
that's
that up for a sec, though, Wendell. There's clearly a lot of markets within Canada that are functioning relatively well. You just mentioned Regina. You mentioned Winnipeg, among other communities, are doing well. So why is that? You said they're leaving them alone?
Yeah, leaving them alone. There's too much regulation. Prices have gone up a little bit, not
Yeah.
huge, nothing like Vancouver, Toronto, or Montreal. But yeah, they have largely left it alone. But here's the great fear. Okay, the urban planning community wants to make everybody Vancouver and everybody Toronto. They want the same policies. I can take you to places in Texas where the urban planners are trying to do this. Okay, fortunately, the political structure doesn't permit them to succeed. So my sense is the ultimate challenge for Canada in terms of saving its middle class is to preserve the housing markets where people can still afford housing.
Okay.
That's crucial.
All right. So this is something to keep very much in perspective. It's almost like a, dare I say, a fashion trend when it comes to this way of thinking. It can spread right across the country. And clearly, Vancouver, Toronto, among other markets, are not working. They are in effect destroying their city environment. I know that anecdotally in these cities, it's extremely hard to be able to recruit anyone, even on a higher income, who would want to move to those communities because it's simply not affordable.
Well, exactly. And you know, for example, you take Vancouver with by far the highest cost of living, I'm confident, in Canada, had in the 2016 election only average median income, barely above the national average. Toronto was amazingly not that much above either. It was 6,000 above, but Vancouver was only 2,000 above.
So, Wendell, we've got a number of questions here, one of which is, what do we need to do to create or knock down these land restriction policies? In fact, have you seen any examples worldwide where this is happening? Because it seems like once they're enacted, it's very hard to reform.
There's no question about it. It's like a ratchet effect, and the successes have not been, have just plain not been there.
Sorry, just to clarify, you said a ratchet?
Ratchet it up. In other words, exactly. It's sort of like because once you take someone who lives in a house that should be worth $300,000, but you've made it now cost $1.5 or $1.8 billion. They don't want you to do anything that might reduce the cost. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't in Vancouver and Toronto be trying to reform the regulation on the fringe to try to at least stop the further increases. But the real crucial thing is to try to stop it from spreading. And it is spreading like you cannot believe. If you look at the greater Toronto, outside the Toronto CMA, you have places like Guelph, Kitchener-Waterloo, London, Brampton. The house prices are going up toward Toronto levels. And just across the Straits of Georgia, where I used to live as a kid in Courtenay, and in Nanaimo, and in Ladysmith, and in Victoria, the prices are exploding over there. And it's because the same kinds of regulations that exist in Toronto under the aegis of the province exist on Vancouver Island. And the same kind of policies that exist in Greater Toronto occur in the other cities around Toronto. So that's a real problem. And so the real crucial thing is to refocus public attention on affordability. You simply cannot deal with affordable housing in a situation where the land costs are so high.
Okay, so to look at it from the other side, I'm a homeowner and I like the idea that the price of my house is going up a lot. So it's almost feels like I'm a, dare I say, a landed aristocrat whose value of home continues to skyrocket. I know that there's that younger generation out there that desperately wants to get a house and form a family and go forward in their life. But well, you know what? this is just a popular area to live. So, that's just tough and that's the way it is. But in the meantime, I'm looking forward to cashing out and doing what I want to do. So how do you deal? Like, I hear that all the time. And this is a
Well,
really big problem then, isn't it? To go down and ratchet this down. What can we realistically achieve as a solution then?
in the markets that have been destroyed, where the competitive market for land has been destroyed, there may not be anything. But I hasten to suggest, because there are a lot of economists out there that really haven't looked closely at electoral dynamics, that think it happened in Vancouver because the people wanted higher prices. No, nobody ever submitted the land use policies of Vancouver to any sort of a referendum, or in Toronto or whatever. What you had was planners and planning establishments seeking what they thought was best. Now, that's only to basically say there isn't anything that you, for example, because I'm sure your house, David, is more expensive than it would be if it were, say, in Winnipeg. You didn't do anything to cause that to happen, and neither did your brethren around and sisters around Toronto and Vancouver. But it is very difficult, and that's why I'm more concerned about preserving affordability where it's not been lost. In the long run, there is some hope, though, coming out of the pandemic, because we have the huge increase in remote work. It's happening all over. The last I read, downtown Toronto was effectively a ghost town, as is downtown New York, downtown Chicago, downtown San Francisco, et cetera, as people are basically voting with their feet and now working from home. And that is likely to be a big deal in the long run. As people do this more, there is the hope that such movements may begin to moderate prices, but that's a long time. My concern is not 10, 20 years from now. My concern is the things that can go wrong in the next few years in terms of increasing regulations in the parts of Canada that remain affordable. That's got to be preserved.
All right. So speaking of the risk model, we know full well that many countries are on a tear in terms of spending. Inflation is rising. Certainly in Canada, last time I checked, we're edging towards 5% inflation. And guess what? We're headed for another era, as in the 1970s, of stagflation, a low growth economy, high inflation, high unemployment, and all the rest, the worst of all worlds. So as we look to that reality and we look at central banks increasing inevitably interest rates, how does housing look to you?
Well, again, I think it's going to be a real problem. And as central banks increase interest rates, that's going to hurt the people in Saskatoon and Regina, just like it hurts them in Vancouver and Toronto, because interest rates are essentially set at the international or certainly the national level. And in Canada, you have something more of a problem than we have in the States, because here, just about every mortgage, seems to me anyway, is a 30-year note, and I signed my note a long time ago, and the interest rate never increased. But if you have the renewable mortgages, which tend to be in greater number in Canada, homeowners could be faced with interest rates increases midterm. So that is a real problem.
Okay.
But the thing about it is that Canada, by some calculations, Canada has the largest middle class in the world in terms of percentage of its population. That came out about 5 years ago, based on Luxembourg Consulting. The point is, with what's going on in housing, you're going to lose it.
Okay, thank you for that warning. We've got a number of questions from our audience. What impact does immigration, a federal policy responsibility, have on housing affordability in your mind?
Well, let me put it this way. We're talking about demand. It doesn't matter whether the person buying your house was born in China or India or in Kelowna. Demand is demand. Any increase in demand in a market that's constrained will have the impact of putting pressure on prices of houses to go higher. So the problem is not immigration. The problem is not foreign buyers. It is a failure of the regulatory model that has been adopted in places like Vancouver and Toronto.
Right. But it's a classic case in some ways of the left hand not knowing what the right hand is doing, because it does for more demand in a situation that obviously does not have that supply, to
Right.
people's tragic consequences as people desperately try to find a home. Another question. This question says Japan was one of the first countries to have land containment policies. They had a policy of self-sufficiency in rice production. And this meant that no residential property could be built on any rice field. Who knew? This meant that in the 1970s and 80s, property prices went through the roof and took 3 generations to buy a home. Has Japan come to terms with their land containment policies, Wendell?
Actually, that doesn't track with my understanding of Japan at all. Japan's housing affordability is pretty good. Yes, they do have a highly regulated system, but it is a whole lot more liberal than the urban containment situation.
Okay.
Tokyo, for example, you think about urban areas. I do a lot of work on urban areas. The Tokyo urban area covers 3,300 square miles. It is the second most sprawling urban area in the world. Now, granted, they have almost twice as many people, but they've been pretty successful. And I am not sure that the property bubble that occurred in Japan, and ended around 1990, I'm not sure that there was much of a residential contribution to that. I think it had more to do with commercial properties and the Ginza and in the core of the urban areas of Japan.
Yeah, so perhaps that requires a little bit more in-depth analysis. So in your analysis worldwide, just to refresh our memory of the incredible index that you table every year in January, and we're privileged in Frontier to release that every January. What does that index look like? It's interesting. I don't know if our listeners heard that, but can you just review what is the least affordable, and then work your way down the list, and how does Canada fit into that?
Yeah, again, it's the median house price divided by the median household income. The highest that we rate is Hong Kong at 21. Vancouver is second at 13. Sydney is at 11 or 12. And then you get down into all sorts of markets in the United States and Canada. And there are markets in Canada that are below 3, in New Brunswick, for example. So again, we run essentially, I think our lowest number last year was 2.4 and our highest was 21. Okay, so it's a big range.
And who's at 2.4?
What's that?
Who is at 2.4, Wendell?
Fredericton.
So let's move to Fredericton.
Yeah. Well, and it really is amazing. What a lot of people don't realize, you go back to 1971, the highest cost market in Canada was Vancouver at 4.3. In 1970, every market in the United States was below 3, except for New York, which was 3.2. Today, San Francisco, San Jose, and LA are all around 10. Okay.
Wow.
So again, you can point to the same thing. It is urban containment policy. And by the way, let me also say, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Well, I was just going to clarify, Wendell, as we get to those horrendous ratios of unaffordability, is there a tipping point, to use that phrase, where this starts to really break down and people finally figure out that the host of policies that we're trying to employ here are not a solution?
I don't think there is. I think there's no exit to this unless you begin to do things. I mean, first of all, you don't let it happen where it hasn't happened. Secondly, you begin to do some moderate relaxation of regulation that's occurring, that occurs on the urban fringe. You got to do those things. This is really serious, and it is really not understood.
It's interesting. In the report that you've tabled at the Frontier, one of the incredible quotes from Wendell Cox is, "There is nothing more fundamental in public policy than facilitating higher standards of living and eradicating poverty."
That's right. No, that is so crucial.
So
by the way, it's particularly crucial in a country like Canada, and we're not far behind you on this, where you are relying on such a large inflow of immigrants every year just to maintain your society, because not all of them come over with bags of money.
Another question, does home ownership, that is compared to rental ratios, play a factor in this discussion, Wendell?
I'm not sure I understand the question. I guess what I would make a comment on this. What we've seen in the United States and Canada is that rents have gone up much slower than house prices. It might be surprising, but they have. At the same time, there is a very strong relationship. Now, I don't have the depth of data in Canada that I have in the United States, just because of some special programs we have access to in the United States. But rents go up about 9/10 of the increase. That is, there's a correlation of about 0.90 between house price increases and rent price increases. However, rent prices go up considerably less. So the rental market, even though that's where a lot of the complaints you hear at the moment come from, because it's the young people who are forced to rent, who are faced with this, that are complaining the most, for good reason.
Okay, so to be clear, there's a direct relationship as property values go up with a corresponding increase in rental rates as well.
Absolutely. You can predict, you can reasonably, with reasonable certainty, predict the level of rents based upon the level of house prices.
Okay, so I think just going further on to that question regarding renters versus ownership, home ownership, I'll go on a little bit of a limb, and that begs the question, what does this do to our culture as a society as we create a nation increasingly of renters?
Well, I'm not sure. I may not be the best person to answer that. I guess all I would say is that probably you can expect that you will see more poverty in the long run. Again, I don't have these data for Canada, but the average homeowner in the United States has, I think it's something like 30 times the net worth of the average renter. Now, granted, the average homeowner is a little older and all that kind of thing, but the fact is that we do not associate renting with affluence. And affluence, and I'm not talking about being rich, living on Fifth Avenue or Central Park like that. The basic point is that living a good quality life requires, for the most part and for most people, home ownership.
Okay. I want to just pause for a moment as we get into this discussion further about some urban myths. One of the myths that I hear frequently over many years of being in this business has been smaller lots and higher density improve housing affordability. Is that true, Wendell?
No.
Pardon me?
No, in fact, I know that's popular at the moment, but I give you a local example for Vancouver people. Professor Patrick Condon at the University of British Columbia has, I think, really proven the case here. And by the way, there's a lot of talk like that, and I'll be essentially what you have is people saying, "Oh, regulation's terrible. There's a shortage. Therefore, we've got to do this densification." No, that's what there is no connection there. And what Condon has shown, you might find this hard to believe, but among the urban core cities of the Western world, now I'm talking about cities, not metropolitan areas, the one that has densified most by far is called Vancouver. Vancouver has gone within its current borders, which were its borders effectively in 1951, mind you. Since 1961, has gone from a population, I think it was 384,000 people, to about, I think, 620 at this point. That is a huge densification. No other city that is an urban core that is not expanded has done that, okay? Now, Patrick Condon at UBC believed 20 years ago all of this stuff about densification. He writes about it now. Recently, he's come around, and by the way, he and I still disagree on the solutions, but we agree on the problem. And that is that densification is not going to reduce price. And the plain fact of it is, let's go back to 1960. Or 1970. I mean, housing affordability was at 4.3 in Vancouver, and now it's 17 in the metropolitan area, or not 17, 13. If you look at the city of Vancouver in the 2016 census, the median multiple was 16 compared to 11 in the metropolitan area. So the basic point is what Patrick is pointing out is we've had densification, and anybody who'd been to Vancouver in 61, and I was, would have to say, boy, has Vancouver densified. English Bay, you get out, even Burnaby looks like in English Bay. So the basic point is that it has not improved affordability. And that, and one of the reasons for that is the minute you basically say, you know, you've got that zoning situation where you can only have one house on one lot, but now you can have two houses on that one. You think that the people who sell that are selling don't realize that? When you change zoning to force densification, you essentially increase the price of the land. And that's the real problem. And by the way, I'm not saying there isn't some relationship, but it is nothing like anybody is expecting.
Yeah, it's not going to be significant enough to deal with the issue.
No, the real thing is if there is a reduction, and I doubt there is, and Conda says there isn't, but if there is a reduction, it will be only after the land price increases have occurred, because you don't allow land to be developed for new housing, outside the urban fringe.
Right. So when we also look at myths, tell us about the so-called myth of the jobs housing balance, the whole idea that we've got to design urban communities so there's a real balance of places to live and work. In principle, that sounds like a really great idea. But is it really that simple?
Well, there is a place where the jobs housing balance works. That's called the metropolitan area. It's called the labor market.
So the larger community.
That's right. I mean, the fact is, if you lived in Chilliwack, chances are, unless you're on the train, chances are you're not going to work in downtown Vancouver. The other thing, a lot of people often think about cities as being downtown oriented. Yet if you look at Canadian cities, you find for the most part, downtowns only have about 10 to 15% of the employment of the metropolitan area, including Vancouver and Toronto. The biggest ones, Calgary's maybe at 20%. So the basic point is that the jobs housing balance cannot be addressed below the metropolitan area level. And that's because let's say somebody lives down near the airport or in Richmond, let's say, and boy, they work in Richmond, they work in the airport, okay? But now they get an offer for a job out in New Westminster or Burnaby or Maple Ridge. They're going to go there. That's what the metropolitan area is about. And so jobs housing balance, as Alain Berthaud, French architect who's one of the best urban thinkers in the world, basically says the jobs housing balance exists only in the minds of the planners.
Okay. And further to that, it seems to me that a key assumption there, if the metropolitan area or region is to function well, you need good transportation, e.g. a car with little traffic issues or some framework of transit. Is that correct?
Yeah, and by the way, this may be surprising. Fortunately, with all the advances that are being made with technology, we now can tell you that, how many jobs the average resident of a metropolitan area in Canada can get to by car versus transit. Now, in Vancouver, the average resident of the Vancouver CMA can get to more than 3 times as many jobs by car as by transit in 30 minutes. And by the way, 30 minutes is sort of the international standard. You look at all the Canadian, American cities, et cetera, you'll find 30 minutes or less is the average work trip travel time. We go to Toronto, not even as good, 4.5 times. So you can get to 4.5 times as many jobs in the GTA by car as by transit. Now let's think about this. Let's think about poor people. People who are forced to live on, can only get on transit. Well, first of all, they don't. What's going on in Los Angeles at the moment, where I was involved in establishing the Los Angeles rail system back in the 1970s, okay? Well, what has happened in Los Angeles is we've now spent probably $25 to $30 billion building the new rail system, okay? The ridership on the rail system is 25 on the rail and bus system is 25% below what it was in 1985 when we were planning it. Okay. And what's happened is the prices of cars have gone down. There's been a huge increase in low income, people who buy cars. And the point is, if you're low income and you're dependent upon transit, unless you work downtown, chances are you can't get to your job in a half an hour and you're going to have to buy a car.
Okay.
So access is crucial.
So Wendell, you're saying transit is important, but we have to be quite realistic about how many people ride it.
Yeah, well, the point is transit's about downtown. You look at all of the Canadian major metropolitan areas, the ones over a million, you're going to find that the largest share of workers gets to work by car, except for downtown where transit is dominant. Now think about this, and I don't know if this is still true, but when we did some work for Frontier back in 2012 on Toronto, believe it or not, the largest business center in Toronto was not downtown Toronto. It was the airport area, Mississauga, et cetera, around the airport.
Right.
And the market share in terms of the percentage of people who work downtown Toronto who get there by transit was like 75%. Really, that's big and important, like New York, okay? What we found in the larger employment center of Pearson Airport, it was like 10%. And that's because there's no way, we can't afford to build the system that would get you to your job in a low density area like that. So again, transit works for downtowns, big downtowns very well, and all of your largest Canadian cities have good sized downtowns. But when you have dispersed employment as exists in a lot of other places, you really can't serve that need.
And so the automobile is critical, particularly for social economic mobility.
Exactly. And attempts to basically, a lot of people in the States are interested in trying to say to low income people, well, ride transit. Well, no, if you can get your job better on transit, yeah, by all means, ride transit. But, if you want to support your family, obviously you're going to take the best job you can that you can afford and take the commute on. And the access data, and by the way, it's the same thing you find in cities from China to Australia, the United States, et cetera. The access by car is far better than by transit, though there are the exceptions of downtown Toronto, downtown Montreal, New York, Chicago, San Francisco, essentially.
So Wendell, as we look to solutions, as we look to, dare I say, a glimmer of hope on this issue, who's doing it right? What can we learn from them? If you were king for a day in Canada, what would we be doing to start turning this ship around?
Well, if I were, as I always like to tell people, and did what I need to do, I'd be out that afternoon. But again, let's talk basically about where they're doing it right. Where they're doing it right, it's not that any bunch of officials sat down and thought about this. We were doing it right before all this planning. And I'm not saying there should have been no planning. All I'm saying is we really chose the worst possible option in terms of planning. And if what's happened to affordability isn't proof of that, then I don't know what is. So, but places like Kansas City, Indianapolis, where we've got all sorts of cities. The cities in Texas are doing very well at this point. You've got cities in Canada. You've got Winnipeg, Saskatoon, Regina. You go to Eastern Canada, you get similar situations. Halifax, again, a little more expensive than they should be, but a middle income family is not looking at being forced out of their house or to live in substandard conditions in those cities where they can't buy a detached 1,100 square foot house in the Vancouver area for probably less than $750,000, maybe more.
Well, from my perspective, part of the hope lies, frankly, in this discussion. And dare I say, the last 2 to 3 years, we've noticed that the whole issue of housing affordability has gone far up the list of identified concerns and issues for Canadians, understandably. And this has a huge impact, not only on ourselves and on the impact in terms of poverty, but also for future hope for the next generation. And that is a very important part of the perspective that we've got to keep in mind for this discussion.
Yes, indeed.
So Wendell Cox, I think that pretty well brings to a close our discussion today. I want to thank you so much for your leadership and research on this topic with the Frontier and so many others. And it's been delightful to have our audience participate with numerous questions on this important issue. And we're delighted that we can work with you, Wendell, on that annual index and so many other research projects.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
So thank you very much. The Frontier Center for Public Policy is an independent, not-for-profit organization that undertakes research and education in support of economic growth and social outcomes that will enhance the quality of life of people. So we welcome your support. Frontier accepts no government donations, and so we are delighted and thankful for the support from all our generous donors. In terms of next month, I want to make a special announcement, and that is that on October the 28th, Thursday, will be our next seminar with retired Judge Brian Giesbrecht, as well as Lieutenant Colonel David Redman on the topic of COVID-19, an update, as well as a discussion overview about what's happening internationally. So be sure not to miss that as we look to our next session. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, including our special guest, Wendell Cox, and we wish you and your family a wonderful day. Thank you.